What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. Last year, we started a series at the end of the college football season where we looked at the teams and how they did in one-possession games to try to determine which teams are maybe a little bit overrated, maybe a little bit underrated. Also, just to kind of see what could have been if these teams had won all those close games or lost all those close games. You know, what could have been? Maybe a best worst case scenario type thing. And also, I think it kind of helps us to project ahead to the next season. So it's, yes, this video is about recapping last year, but it's also looking for those teams that might surprise you in 2021. We go back to the SEC last year before we get into this, and there were three teams that stood out to me. The teams that had lost a bunch of one-possession games, teams that you would say maybe were underrated. They weren't as bad as their record. Missouri, Arkansas, and Ole Miss. All three of those teams had much better years in 2020. So I think this does maybe tell us some teams that could maybe surprise. And also, when I was going through these numbers, it seemed like the teams that won a lot of close games last year, they kind of lost those games this year. And the teams that lost the close games last year won the close games this year. It just goes to show you that the odds kind of play out. You're going to normally, split those close games. A team is not going to go 10 years and have a high winning percentage in one possession games, because again, these one possession games are games that could go either way, and it usually kind of balances out. So that was interesting when I looked over the numbers from last year, but from 2019, that is. But let's get into the numbers from 2020 and see which teams maybe were overrated, which teams maybe were underrated, and see which teams could potentially surprise in 2021. So here are the records from 2020, and this will only include the regular season games, because to me the bowl games are just, there's so many opt-outs, so many things going on in those bowl games. I really just like to look at the regular season when doing these types of videos. And we'll start in the East. Florida 8-2, they won the division there. Georgia was 7-2, Missouri 5-5, Kentucky 4-6, Tennessee 3-7, South Carolina 2-8, and Vanderbilt 0-9. So that's how it played out. And again, Missouri out of the East, Missouri was the one team last year that really I thought was underrated based off of how many close games they lost, how many one-possession games they lost. I maybe should have looked into that a little bit more, because I didn't predict Missouri to be very good this year. I think I picked them. They were actually the only team I missed in this division. I had them there at number 8, I believe. Or it's not number. There are not 8 teams. I had them at number 6, that is, just ahead of Vanderbilt. And I did have Georgia winning this division. But other than that, this division actually played out the way I thought. But anyways, Missouri, the one team that was underrated last year in 2019, that is, and they proved that in 2020. So how were these teams in one-possession games this year? Florida was 0-2. They only had 2 one-possession games. They lost both of them. Georgia was 1-0. I believe their one-possession game was Mississippi State. Missouri was 3-0. So again, the team that struggled in the one-possession games in 2019 did really well in the one-possession games in 2020. I'm telling you, I've been looking at these numbers, and that's how it plays out with a lot of teams. Kentucky was 1-1, Tennessee was 1-0, South Carolina 1-2, Vanderbilt 0-3. Yes, Vanderbilt did have 3 one-possession games. Maybe it tells you that Vandy wasn't as bad as maybe you thought, because if they had won those games, obviously things would have been much different. So let's look at what would have happened if these teams had won all of their one-possession games. Florida would have been 10-0. The Gators would have been 10-0, which tells me this team was underrated. And I know they collapsed, and they didn't have anybody playing hardly against Oklahoma. And people will say, well, this team was overrated. Look how they played against Oklahoma. That is, you can't even look at that game for Florida. But look at the Alabama game. They played Alabama tougher than anyone else in the country this year, by far. I mean, they were the only team that had a chance to beat Alabama really realistically in the fourth quarter. I know Ole Miss kept it close, but you never really thought Ole Miss was going to win that game. Florida, underrated, and at full strength, Florida maybe was the second best team in college football this year. Again, at full strength. I know Kyle Pitts missed some games in there, and they didn't have a lot of guys against Oklahoma, like I said, but at full strength, if you look at how they played against Alabama, Florida potentially was the second best team, and these numbers would tell you that they were underrated. Georgia, on the other hand, they won their 1 possession game, so that record wouldn't have changed. Missouri, no change. They were 3-0 in their 1 possession games. Kentucky, if they had lost one of those 1 possession games, they could have been 5-5. Or if they had won one of those 2 1 possession games, they could have been 5-5. So this is kind of best case scenario. Tennessee couldn't have done any better. South Carolina actually could have been 4-6 if they had won the 2 1 possession games that they lost, which would have actually put them ahead of Tennessee. And then Vanderbilt, 3-6. Again, 3 1 possession games for the Commodores that they lost all of those. If they win those games, it's a much different year for Vanderbilt. Derek Mason probably still has a job. So now let's go to the 1 possession games. If they lost the 1 possession games, Florida, they didn't lose. I mean, they lost all of their 1 possession games. So 8-2, this is the worst case scenario for these teams. Georgia, 6-3. If they had lost that game to Mississippi State, could have been a rough year at 6-3. But look at Missouri, 2-8. They could have been 2-8 if they lost those close games. Maybe this year Missouri was overrated a little bit. Maybe they were underrated in 2019. Maybe overrated a little bit in 2020. We know this division in the East just wasn't very good this year. So perhaps Missouri not as good as some people might think. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story coming into next year, because there are a lot of different variables with who these teams have coming back. So keep that in mind. I think Missouri is going to return a lot, so I do expect Missouri to be pretty good. Kentucky at 3-7. If they had lost one of those 2 1 possession games, or if they had lost both of those 1 possession games, they would have been 3-7. Tennessee could have been 2-8. Could have been an even worse year. And same thing for South Carolina. They could have been 1-9. Could you imagine 1-9? And really, they were lucky to beat Auburn in that game. One of their 2 wins. Auburn was the better team. It was just a weird game. Auburn was dominating early on, and then South Carolina just somehow found a way to win. That was a very strange game, but South Carolina could have been 1-9. So you're talking about anywhere from 1-9 to 4-6 for the Gamecocks. Vanderbilt would have been 0-9 because they didn't win any 1 possession games. So we balance it out, and this is just kind of if the teams split their 1 possession games, which is normally what happens. You know, Kentucky, they split theirs. They're the only team that split them down the middle. What would their record have been if they split the 1 possession games? What would the standings have looked like? And I think this gives you a better indication of really what order these teams should be ranked. It again doesn't tell the whole story. Wins and losses absolutely matter, but just based off of how good these teams were, sometimes this can give you a better idea of which teams are better than their record and worse than their record. Florida would have been 9-1. We all know they should have beat LSU, and they had a chance to beat Texas A&M. If they don't fumble on that final drive, they probably win that game. Georgia could have been 6-5 and 2-5, so a little bit different there. Missouri could have been 3-5 and 6-5. That would be the average. So 3 or 4 wins for them, again, tells you that they maybe were overrated a little bit. Maybe they overperformed. Kentucky, 4-6, no change. Tennessee, a little bit lower. South Carolina would have been a little bit better. Vanderbilt would have been much better. They would have won 1 or 2 games if they split their 1 possession games. So this is just interesting to look at as we look at the SEC East. We're going to go to the West now and see if we see anything. But for me here in the West, or in the East, I should say, Florida and Missouri are the 2 teams that kind of jump out. Florida was probably underrated. They probably were a top 4 team at full strength. Missouri maybe overrated a little bit, and maybe Vanderbilt was underrated as well, as they were 0-3 in those 1 possession games. In the West, Alabama was 10-0, A&M 8-1, Auburn 6-4, LSU 5-5, Ole Miss 4-5, Arkansas and Mississippi State both finished 3-7. And like I said, where were the teams that were underrated in 2019? Ole Miss and Arkansas, and they both were better in 2020. We'll see what happened this year in the 1 possession games. We see Alabama, they didn't have any 1 possession games in the regular season. Texas A&M was 2-0. Auburn was 2-1. LSU was 3-1. So despite a 5-5 record, it could have been much worse for the Tigers. Ole Miss was 2-2. Arkansas 1-3. Mississippi State 1-3. So Arkansas is a team that really in back-to-back years struggled in the 1 possession games. Maybe that tells you that they're about ready to really break through in 2021, that they've been much better than their record suggests the last couple of years. Just something to keep an eye on. We'll see if Arkansas is a team that really explodes in 2021, which is possible. They got a lot coming back. this could be a pretty good team. So what if these teams won all of their one-possession games? Obviously, that would not have changed anything for Alabama because they would still be 10-0. A&M still would be 8-1. Their one loss came in a game that was not a one-possession game. Auburn would have been 7-3. They would have had one more win if they beat South Carolina. We talked about that one earlier. LSU could have added another win, could have been 6-4. Ole Miss could have been 6-3 if they win their close games. Could have been 6-3. Arkansas could have been 6-4. Mississippi State could have been 6-4. So again, Mississippi State's a team that was maybe underrated a little bit this year. The record's only 3-7, but they were in 4 one-possession games, and 3 of those did not go their way. So all of these teams in the West really could have had much different years. Could have been much better, which is very interesting. How about if they lost those one-possession games? It wouldn't affect anything for Alabama, again, because they didn't have any one-possession games. A&M could have been 6-3. Maybe the Aggies were a little bit overrated, and I think the bowl game maybe would show that a little bit. If you look at the game against North Carolina, a game I thought they would win easily, they had to come down to the fourth quarter to win that game. So a 6-3 record for the Aggies. If they lose those close games, they had the one-possession game to Florida. I can't remember the other one. Auburn could have been 4-6. And you talk about that Arkansas game that most people say that they really lost. Yeah, it could have been a much worse year for Auburn. LSU could have been 2-8. If they lose their one-possession games, LSU, the defending national champs, would have been 2-8 this past year. Maybe they were actually overrated a little bit. Not underrated, overrated. And again, this doesn't tell the whole story. LSU was a pretty good team at the end of the year, although they did struggle early on. Ole Miss 2-7. So it goes both ways for them. They could have had a much better year, could have been a much worse year because they split those one-possession games. Arkansas could have been one game worse, could have been 2-8, and same thing for Mississippi State. They also could have been 2-8 if they lost that one game that they did win in a one-possession game. So now let's look at what would have happened if they split the one-possession games. And obviously, like we saw with the East, some of these records are going to have a half game in there. But nothing would have changed for Alabama. I mean, Alabama was definitely not overrated because they blew everyone out, obviously. A&M would have been 7-2, would have probably still made it to a New Year's Six Bowl, but they would not have finished ranked number 5. Auburn would have been right there with 5 or 6 wins. LSU would have been 4-6. They would have actually lost one more game, and I think I actually missed the mark on that one. Something doesn't look right with their numbers. Anyways, maybe that is correct. Ole Miss 4-5. They split their one-possession games, so we wouldn't have seen anything really any different with them. Arkansas would have been 4-6. Mississippi State would have been 4-6. So we would have had, if you just look at it like this and look at the rankings, still Alabama and A&M would have been in the top 2. But Auburn, LSU, Ole Miss, Arkansas, Mississippi State, really all, and I guess you could say Auburn would have been number 3. But from LSU down to Mississippi State, those records are very, very similar. And you could say really that any of these teams could have beat any of the other teams. And that's, I think, what we saw on the field. All of these teams seemed to play each other in close games. And it was really wide open here at the bottom of the SEC West because of LSU winning those close games. That's why they finished number 4 in the standings. So again, we look back at these one-possession games to see which teams were overrated and underrated in the West. Maybe A&M was overrated a little bit. LSU maybe overrated a little bit. Maybe Arkansas and Mississippi State were underrated a little bit. We'll see how this carries into 2021. But again, when I look back at the numbers from 2019, they really told a big story heading into 2020. And if I had paid more attention to that, I probably would have been a little bit more accurate on my predictions. For example, Arkansas and Mississippi State, or Arkansas and Ole Miss, I should say. Actually, I think I did a pretty good job with Ole Miss. But Arkansas, a team that I think maybe gave them 1 or 2 wins, should have seen that coming when you look at how many one-possession games they have lost, really the last 2 years for Arkansas. If they can kind of turn that around and win those close games in 2021, Arkansas could be a team that finishes more towards the middle of the pack, I think, in 2021 in the SEC West. So your thoughts on this? Just something that is fun to look at as we see which teams maybe were a little bit overrated, maybe a little bit underrated heading into the 2021 college football season. Give me your thoughts, your comments down below. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.